welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Land of Devils and Dragons, Amazing Animals of Australia and Tasmania, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader Mike Hillman. It's wonderful to have you with us today, Mike. I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, and welcome everyone to my presentation today. To give you a little bit of my background, I've been a guide with Natural Habitat Adventures for a few years now, and I specifically work in North America. I guide in Greenland, up in Churchill, over in Yellowstone, as well as in Alaska. And I got my degree in zoology. That's how I kind of came to really love wild animals. As a child, I grew up on shows like Crocodile Hunter with Steve Irwin and David Attenborough and things like that. I really enjoy talking about animals. My family and friends know all about the fact that I was always giving them fun facts about interesting and weird creatures. And I definitely, through watching Steve Irwin and learning more and more about Australian animals as I grew up, really just kind of was attracted a lot to all these interesting and weird creatures that you find specifically in Australia. And before I became a guide with Natural Habitat Adventures, I was actually an educator as well as zookeeper in the zoo and aquarium field. I worked for a number of different zoological institutions, and that's where I was able to actually work one-on-one with a lot of different Australian animals and be able to talk about them to various guests that I would meet. And so from there, and with my zoology background, I really enjoy talking about Australian animals. And that's kind of why I wanted to build this presentation and talk a little bit about Australian animals. Because if you've seen some of my previous webinars through our Daily Dose of Nature series, I've done a lot of different interesting critters, and typically there's an Australian animal or two snuck into most of my presentations because they're so interesting and there's a lot of weird and interesting facts about them. So it's a lot of fun for me to talk about them, and it's typically a lot of fun for my audiences to learn about them. So if you haven't got a chance, do check out Natural Habitat Adventures YouTube page, or you can even go on the Nat Hab website at nathab.com and then pull up some of those daily dose of natures and get to learn some more about some interesting animals or about different locations around the world. So today, of course, we're talking about Australia. And when people think of Australia, oftentimes they're thinking about the natural landscape and the sights, things like Uluru or Ayers Rock, or the cultural aspects of it, things like the Sydney Opera House. And hopefully, just like myself, you're thinking oftentimes a lot about the nature, the wildlife that inhabit Australia. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of these really interesting creatures and get you to hopefully get jazzed about going to a place like Australia. Now, what really sets Australia apart when it comes to why we have so much unique and interesting animals in a place like Australia is that 80% of their plants, mammals, reptiles, frogs, and about 50% of the birds are what's called endemic, meaning that they're found nowhere else in the world. And why is that? Well, part of it has to do with the plate tectonics. If we go back hundreds of millions of years, we have Pangaea, the supercontinent, and then at a certain point, we have Antarctica and Australia splitting off together around 100 million years ago. And then from there, they start separating at about 85 million years ago. And then about between 45 and 30 million years ago, Australia is out on its own. It's not bashing into any other continents. It's not exchanging wildlife back and forth. And so for that really long time, 35 million years ago or so, they have evolution is basically running only in Australia and it's not trading animals back and forth. And that's part of what makes it so unique. And in addition to that, it actually, because of where it sits on the globe and its latitude and the fact that the geology has been relatively stable, we get a lot of different types of habitats. Most people, when they think of Australia, they think of the outback, right? Any nature show starts talking about the outback when they're talking about Australia. And certainly the red center, those arid regions are a vast portion of Australia, but it has a large diversity of habitats. You've got up in the north along the Cape York Peninsula, you have the rainforests. Then along the coastlines all the way around, you have these lush either rock crevices and habitats or these massive wetland environments. You have mountain ranges and even pine forests and snow. And not a lot of people expect that when we're talking about Australia. And it's also quite large. People, when they try to visit Australia, usually think, oh, I can go for a week and then see Australia. But realistically, it takes a lot to see a good chunk of the country. You can see here how big it is compared to the United States. Even Tasmania on its own is the size of West Virginia. So it's a big place. And so it's understandable that it has a lot of unique and interesting wildlife on a continent as large as that. Now, because of that, when I'm going to be talking about wildlife today, I realized I had to kind of filter myself a little bit or rein myself in, because talking about wildlife all over Australia, you're talking hours upon hours of webinars. So I'm only going to stick to the northern route of our itinerary as well as the southern route of the itinerary that Nat Hab does. We have two different itineraries in Australia. And I'm going to really kind of focus wildlife that could be reasonably seen on one of those routes and kind of use that as my filter as I talk about wildlife today. That being said, even then, I still kind of consider this presentation more or less a sampler platter of Australian animals. You could spend a lot of time talking about even just the animals along one of these routes. And so I'm kind of picking and choosing some of my favorite animals as a zoologist that I love learning and talking about, and hopefully you will as well over the course of this presentation. Now, one of my backgrounds is that I am a bird watcher, and I love on my trips pointing out birds as we're going along the way. So why not start there? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the bird life that we have in Australia. And let me tell you, it's got some great ones. I've already said about 46% of the bird life in Australia is endemic, found nowhere else in the world. All in all, they have over 850 species of birds that can be found in Australia. And just to pull out a few of my favorites, here is our first one. This one you may be familiar with, the laughing kookaburra. Even if you're not familiar with the bird, you're probably familiar with its call. It's a member of the kingfisher family. In fact, it's the largest of the kingfisher family. And they can eat fish, but they eat a lot of other animals as well. But even if you haven't heard of these guys before, their call has been used a lot in movies. So I'm going to crank my volume here, and hopefully you guys can hear the kookaburra call. So that is an iconic call that you can hear in many places around Australia, and certainly is a bird that I had to pull out just for the noise alone. In addition, this is another one of my personal favorites. This is called a Tawny Frogmouth. This is a nocturnal animal that eats a lot of small critters, things like lizards and frogs and insects and things like that. And reason why I like them, in addition to the fact that they look kind of weird with those big eyes, they're nocturnal, so it helps with that. They also look a little bit like a living Muppet. I mean, look at this picture right here. That big wide open mouth to eat some pretty large prey or eat insects very, very easily. I actually worked with this species in the zoo. We had a tawny frogmouth named Jara, and for whatever reason, he hated male voices, hated men's voices. The lower tone must have set him off. So anytime I handled him, I couldn't talk, because the second I would say something, he would start getting aggressive and try and biting me or something like that. So he certainly was an interesting bird to handle, and a lot of personality behind that Muppet face, which makes one of these guys pretty interesting. Now, another one that you might actually be familiar with without realizing it are the bowerbirds. We have a few in Australia. And one in particular, the satin bowerbird, is probably one, if you've seen any of the kind of big ticket BBC natural history documentaries in the last 10 years or so, you're actually probably familiar with bowerbirds, even though you may not realize it. This male is interesting on his own right, just with that beautiful kind of satiny, deep, dark blue coloration. But what makes this species so interesting is how this male tries to impress this female, who's a little bit more of a drab, olivey green, but still beautiful in her own right. And for whatever reason, this female really likes a man who's great with architecture as well as interior design. So watching HGTV or something like that. But she wants him to create this beautiful bower, which you can see behind him right now are these two kind of spires of sticks that actually form a bit of a tunnel. And he builds that up himself. And when she comes in to investigate to see his handiwork, she goes into that tunnel and then she sits in the middle there while she watches him dancing out on the dance floor. But it's important that that dance floor is well decorated. And typically satin bowerbirds really like the color blue. And ordinarily out in nature, they'll find things like blue flowers and blue berries and things like that. But Those bowerbirds that are near human habitation find blue plastic really desirable as well. So this particular individual has brought in all these blue pieces, decorated his little dance floor, and now is waiting for a female to come in and see how he's doing. So it's a pretty interesting behavior seeing from this bowerbird. In addition, speaking of blue, Australia actually has penguins too. So most people, when they think of penguins, they're thinking of Antarctica, right? All cold weather species. Well, there's 23 species of penguins, and most of them are actually more warmer weather penguins. Only a few of them are actually 100% year-round cold weather. And a blue penguin is found in southern Australia, as well as New Zealand. And it's known as a blue penguin, but it's also known as the fairy penguin or the little penguin. I kind of cover all my bases. Usually when I talk about these guys, I call them little fairy blues, just to cover all the bases of the regional names that they can be known by. And they are quite small. They only come up to about 13 inches tall, which means they are the smallest kind of penguin out there in the environment. And that's about the same size as a football, just to give you a size reference there. And they live in these burrows during the night, and then they head out during the day, in some cases walking up to 2 kilometers from their burrow out to the shore, and they'll swim out in the open ocean just like other penguins do, catching things like krill and shrimp and fish. Now, even though they're in Australia, some of these currents can be quite cold, and so like other penguins, they're adapted to that, and they have upwards of 10,000 feathers covering their body from head to toe. And unlike other birds, though, is penguins have a difficulty with molting, meaning shedding their feathers out. Just like our hair, their feathers get frayed and damaged over time, and they need to be able to replace those. Now, most birds, like your sparrows or robins outside, replace a couple feathers at a time. But if a penguin were to do that, they actually would have always a hole in their waterproof armor, and they would get cold very, very quickly. So they have to shed all their feathers at once, which means they can't swim for upwards of 2 to 3 weeks. So in preparation for that, they become pigs, and they increase their body size by about 250%, get really, really fat, so they can then head out on land and then shed all their feathers at once, which is called a catastrophic molt, and it looks like a catastrophe. I worked with penguins before, and I don't know if there's any other animal as miserable as a penguin during molting season. They are shedding all those feathers at once. It's got to be uncomfortable. They're growing all the feathers back in, and they can't rinse or bathe or anything like that. So I certainly give it up to our little fairy blues when they have to go through something like that. Now, just as another aside, kind of an interesting fact about our fairy penguins is that their scat, if you were to collect it and look at it, they can't digest all parts of the fish. They get pretty close, but they leave some of the scales behind, and that passes through. So when you look at their scat, if you look closely at the screen, you'll see that it kind of sparkles. They actually have glittery scat because of the fact that they're eating all of these fish. So it just really lends itself to our fairy penguin, which I think is a little fun aside on the side. Right, moving on to some other flightless birds. This is the emu. Of course, it's going to be our biggest bird in Australia, and they're great to see, super interesting birds. But I want to talk to you about one you may not be as familiar with, which is one of my personal favorites, the southern cassowary. It's a cousin to the emu, but you can see it looks a whole lot different. This is a species that's just a little bit smaller than emu, so it gets 3rd place as far as biggest bird. Of course, ostrich, emu, then cassowary. They get up to about 6 feet tall and weigh 160 pounds. That is a big turkey. And this is a rainforest species found in northeastern Australia, and they move through the environment going after small animals, but they also really love to eat fruit. In particular, a lot of the fruit in rainforests where they're found have these very thick outer shells, not a lot of fruit to them, but also big seeds. So they're not super useful to a lot of animals, but our cassowary here will actually swallow those seeds whole, and in their gizzard grind away that tough outer texture, get what little fruit and nutrition they can out of it, and then they pass those seeds unharmed out the other end. And so scientists estimate that they actually are critical to spreading seeds of anywhere between 75 and 100 different species of plants in the rainforest. They're literally the gardeners of the rainforest, which makes them super important to have in Australia, to have those beautiful rainforests that I'm talking about here. Now, in addition to that, really the reason I personally like them is they are so prehistoric looking. Just look at that picture. That stare down is a little bit intimidating, but then you look at their feet and you'll see here just those really dinosaur-like scales, and then their claws on their feet can be upwards of 5 inches long. So they are considered probably the most dangerous bird in the world because of what they've got as weaponry. And on top of that, they also have a pretty crazy sound. They sound like a dinosaur. I'll play that song for you. So these deep bellows. Hisses and roars. I mean, if you saw that foot and heard that noise, first thing, dinosaur. That's what you'd think. Super cool. And on top of that, just like the satin bowerbird, I also have a thing for blue as a color, and so that also strikes me just a little bit, and one of the reasons I really like cassowaries. Now, we're going to switch from birds. We're going to move into mammals, but I'm going to start with a little quiz time. Take a look at your screen here and see if you can come up with which one of these words is made up, is one that I made up. Well, actually, these are all actual words. This is a trick question. They are all actual words for different types of mammals, in particular marsupials, that you can find in Australia. Some of them are Aboriginal words. Some of them are Greek or Indian or Spanish. And so a lot of people outside of Australia haven't heard of the vast diversity of marsupials and all the little individual ones. Typically, when you hear about marsupials, you're like, okay, the kangaroo and the koala. But in Australia, they have 250 different types of marsupials. And so I want to talk about a few of them. But the first question you get is, why so many marsupials? Well, if you're not familiar, let's recap what a marsupial is. So unlike a placental mammal, like humans, like dogs, like cattle and elephants, marsupials give birth when they're young, are incredibly underdeveloped. And then what you're seeing right here, this little young kangaroo is climbing out of the birth canal, onto its mother's fur, and it's climbing into that pouch that makes, that really sets apart other marsupials. Then from there, that little youngster, incredibly underdeveloped, it doesn't even have access to move its legs. It's just moving its arms like an army crawl, then grabs onto a teat, and then from there continues the rest of the growth process outside of mom, essentially inside the safety of that pouch. Now, in Australia, kind of what I alluded to with those variety of habitats, we have a lot of differences in how much water there is. There can be very arid regions, there's these massive wetlands, different times of year leads to dry seasons and wet seasons. We have massive storms and wind coming in. We even have the bushfires that a lot of people heard about in 2019. And all of those combined together, all those constantly changing environmental factors is the reason why scientists theorize that we have more marsupials in Australia than in other parts of the world. There's still 100 marsupial species outside of Australia, but having just 250 there, the reason most likely is the fact that, say an elephant wants to give birth, it's going to have a roughly two-year pregnancy. So over that time, a lot can happen in the environment. So if you can give birth relatively quickly while your young is still a little bit underdeveloped, and if things change and you can't raise that youngster where your survival is the most important, then our marsupial is able to do something like that. So they're not putting a large amount of investment in their young until they know that the environment can support the young that they're trying to raise. And no more can you see that really happening than in the Bandicoot. So this is a small type of marsupial, looks a little bit like a rat. And they actually have one of the shortest pregnancies of any mammal. They tie a few other species for the lowest at just 12 days. She mates, and less than 2 weeks later, she's already giving birth. And those young come out incredibly small, only about the width of your pinky at about 1 centimeter, meaning they're only about 2% of her overall length. And she can have upwards of 7 of them that leave the birth canal, crawl into that pouch, grab onto a teat, and then from there continue to nourish. And then if conditions are good, then she could have potentially several different batches of offspring in just one season. And so when there is a boon for these guys, you could see Bandicoot all over the place because they breed so well. And where there's a boon for prey, there's oftentimes a boom for predators. And green tree pythons, they're found in northern part of Australia, in Cape York, the rainforest, and similar places to where you can see those cassowaries. And they're super interesting. They're one of my all-time favorite snakes, partially because of that beautiful green coloration they have going on, but they also are a perfect example of convergent evolution. And what that is that two species, relatively unrelated to each other, live in different habitats across the globe, but those habitats end up being quite similar. And so those two species evolved to meet the challenges of that habitat in much the same way. So for a green tree python, its convergent evolution cousin, if you will, is the emerald tree boa. So you can see the green tree python over in New Guinea and parts of Australia, and then the emerald tree boa found in northern South America in the Amazon rainforest. And so they exist in very similar types of habitat, and so they've evolved to meet those needs in very similar ways. So here on the left is our emerald tree boa, and of course our green tree python on the right. Look how similar they are. Certainly to the untrained eye, you would think they're the same species. The emerald tree boa can have variable coloration with that white that you see on there, but actually so can the green tree python. And this coloration, scientists actually think is because they're trying to blend in, camouflage in the rainforest, hence the green. But a tree branch oftentimes get birds droppings on it because birds are flying through the rainforest. And so they're mimicking those bird droppings along their body. And that's why you see the white or the speckled yellow or things like that along our snake, which is really cool. They're so similar that even as youngsters, the emerald tree boa and the green tree python start off as either yellow or red and then turn green as they grow up, what's called ontogenetic change. And so it's super fascinating. The youngsters even camouflage in the same way as babies and then grow up to be those big green adults, look exactly identical, but one's a boa and one's a python. They're a little bit different. And they hunt in a lot of the same ways. They're ambush hunters. So you can see this guy curled up right here. This is another python. And they'll sit there and wait for prey to come to them. In much the same way, both species have heat sensing pits along the front of their body, front of their nose, and they use them like little heat-seeking missiles, if you will, to figure out where their prey is and be able to grab on and bite it really effectively. So if a mammal like a bandicoot or something like that were to crawl across this branch, they know exactly where it is and be able to bite it super accurately when they do. Super cool snakes. Now, let's go from the snakes to another animal you can find in the trees, and that's our koala bear. And before we get too far, I want to X bear out of your vernacular. They aren't bears, they aren't related to bears. They superficially look a lot like teddy bears, and so that's where it comes. But in Australia, they're known as koalas. And they're specialists, unlike some of these other animals I've been talking about that eat a lot of different types of critters or a lot of different types of food. Our koalas only eat eucalyptus. And of the 50 or so odd species that our koalas can eat throughout Australia, typically those species of trees are found in just specific regions, overlapping with massive range of the koalas that can be found in Australia. And so that means that each individual koala usually has a preference, like I find these 2 or 3 species of trees the most tasty. And so they really specialize even further than just going towards eucalyptus leaves, specializing on just a few species in a specific region. Now, the reason why they go after our koala leaves is because they are readily available in these eucalyptus and gum forests that you can find in Australia. But unfortunately, they meet these challenges in that the leaves are incredibly tough to digest. They'll eat upwards of 2 pounds of leaves a day, but only getting about 25% of the nutrition out of that. That being said, they are actually able to get a lot of the moisture they need out of it. In fact, the female koalas, which are just a bit smaller than the males, will actually get most, if not all, of their moisture from the leaves, never having to drink from a pool or a pond or anything like that. Now, these forests you can see right here, the eucalyptus forests, meaning as these koalas are high up in these trees, they don't have to worry about any herbivores down on the ground or any herbivores up in the sky or through the trees climbing around, because eucalyptus is incredibly toxic. In fact, just about 3/4 of a teaspoon of eucalyptus oil would be fatal to a human. So no other animal really specializes on eating a very tough leaf that's also incredibly toxic and poisonous. But they have a downfall to having competition out in the forest for these leaves, and their digestive system takes so much effort to digest it that they sleep a lot in the process, upwards of 18 to 20 hours. So they're essentially the Australian sloth, eating some leaves, then sleeping out most of the day. And they even have an adaptation for that sleep. Along the back of their rump, they have this thick cartilaginous pad beneath the skin that acts almost like a little seat cushion that they can press up against the limbs, like you see in this picture right here, and still make it quite comfortable while they sleep. And I gotta say, seeing different positions of koalas while they sleep is pretty hysterical. They find different ways to make it happen. When you're sleeping 18 to 20 hours a day, you gotta get creative. Now, moving from koalas to understandably the other famous marsupial of Australia, we have the kangaroo. And if you've been to Australia or maybe done some research in Australia, you've probably heard that there also are the small version, which are the wallabies. But did you know there's also a mid-range or a mid-sized version called the wallaroo? Now, the differences between them, there are size differences, but it's kind of arbitrary depending on each species. Some, like the wallabies, eat a lot of smaller foods than the kangaroos, but there can be a lot of overlap. Now, when we talk specifically about our eastern gray kangaroo, this is the species most people see when they come to Australia. It's a pretty interesting species of kangaroo. In fact, the name kangaroo came from eastern gray kangaroos. The word gangaroo, which is a word from Aboriginal peoples in the northeast of Australia, was specifically targeted towards eastern gray kangaroo. And eventually that term, over time, changed subtly, and then is now definition the name for all kangaroo species that we see throughout Australia. And somewhat similar to our snakes, our green tree python and our boa, our kangaroo kind of is a bit of a convergent evolution with our deer that you can see in North America. They are kind of a mid-range size herbivore. They're eating grasses and leaves and things like that. They're found in forested as well as kind of open grassland environments. They also have a very similar relationship to people in that there's a hunting season for them. You can eat the meat and use the skin for leathers, things like that. They also are a pest in farm fields and in gardens, and they can be quite dangerous if you were to hit one on the road. So deer and kangaroos, you can kind of think of them in the same light. But of course, the main difference is that hopping ability, right? And so kangaroos' hopping ability is pretty exceptional. And it actually allows them to very efficiently travel over vast landscapes throughout Australia. You can see this animation here with those two legs hopping, that tail acts as the counterbalance. And what's happening internally is their legs have these very stretchy tendons that act a bit like a spring. So when their foot hits the ground, that spring stretches. You can see in the center photo there. And then when they go to leap the next hop, that tendon reconciles and that launches them forward, saving up some of that energy, recycling the energy from the previous hop. What's even cooler is the act of hopping opens and closes their diaphragm, and so they don't have to worry about breathing while they're hopping because their body automatically pumps that lung as they're hopping along, which is super cool. And all that combined means that our kangaroos can be quite athletic. Top speed was set by an eastern gray kangaroo, 40 miles an hour. And in one of those hops, they can clear upwards of 25 feet from one hop to the next, which is pretty incredible out on the landscape. Now, because they're so specialized with hopping, they have to, if they want to go slow, do kind of a weird crawl. This is what you're seeing right here in this video, where the front legs and back legs are moving in unison with their tail. So they're using actually 5 limbs rather than typical 4 to move along through the landscape, with that tail acting a bit like a crutch and helping lift those big hopping legs on the back. All those adaptations mean that kangaroos actually have a very difficult time going just straight backwards. They really can't go backwards very, very easily. And so that's why the kangaroo is on the seal of the government of Australia, is it's supposed to symbolize that kangaroos, like Australia, only moves forward and can never go backward, which is pretty interesting. Now, while you probably know a little bit about kangaroos, I bet you might not know that kangaroos can be found in trees as well. This is, again, in the rainforest regions of Australia. We have this species, the Lumholtz tree kangaroo. That's decent size, about 16 pounds. And like their ground-loving cousins, they are an herbivore. eat a lot of leaves and vines up in the forest. One of my favorite facts about them, they actually have hair that parts along the back and grows down off each side. And what's useful about that, they live in a rainforest with a lot of rain. Understandably, they get caught out in rainstorms every so often, and their fur grows in such a way that as rain hits their body, it runs off rather than soaking them to the bone, which is kind of cool. And on top of that, they're pretty athletic. Because of those awesome back legs and their jumping ability, they can jump from a height of 200 feet and land safely on the ground or on another tree without injuring themselves, which is pretty incredible. It's a huge height. Now, be it tree kangaroos or our ground-loving kangaroos, they have to worry about predators like the dingo. And the dingo is a really interesting species to talk about when we talk about how Australians and cultural history interacts with dingoes. They're a medium-sized dog. They're in fact actually the largest natural predator that you can find in Australia. This is a rescue that's at a sanctuary and research center down in southern Australia. And we don't really know exactly how dingoes got to Australia. There is some genetic evidence which suggests that they probably arrived upwards of 18,000 years ago, maybe through land bridges that would have formed along Southeast Asia into Australia during ice ages, or they may have been a little bit more soon, brought to Australia a little bit sooner, maybe between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, by early peoples that were colonizing Australia. And the reason why this is so interesting and so important to understand is how Australians look at the dingo, because they have sometimes been known as Canis lupus dingo, meaning they're a subspecies of wolf. They've also been known as Canis familiaris, just a different breed of dog. Or recently, a lot of scientists are pushing for Canis dingo, meaning they're their own species. And so depending on whether you consider them a wolf, a breed of dog that's out there on the environment, or their own species, changes how people, how conservationists, how governments interact with a species out on the landscape. Because as you can imagine, having a predator like a wolf out on Australian landscape where you're farming and where you're ranching, you could come into conflict. And that's exactly what happens in Australia. They've actually, because of this, put up a fence called the dingo fence. This is a fence that is one of the longest structures in the world, man-made structures. It's upwards of 3,500 miles long. And this essentially cuts off dingo territory from the southeast, where there's a lot of ranches, a lot of agriculture, and hopefully protects ranchers' sheep and cattle from any dingo attacks by maintaining that fence line. Now, it has been relatively successful. There's a lot less potential attacks on the southeast side where it's protected from dingoes versus the other side, though they have to worry about feral dogs and things like that in the area that aren't dingoes as well. But what the scientists have just come out with a paper have looked at the vegetation cover on one side of the fence and the other. On the natural color side, the brown side right there, that's a satellite image which arguably can't tell the difference. But using special filters with the satellite, they can look at the vegetation cover. And I'll highlight the line here where the fence line is. The actual lower corner there has less vegetation on it than the unfenced area where the dingoes are. And the reason for that is they did some study plots and looked where they just excluded kangaroos. Remember, dingoes eat kangaroos. Just by excluding that herbivore, what otherwise would be a very arid landscape actually has a fair bit of grass in it. And so the dingoes act a lot like the wolves in Yellowstone in that they control the herbivore population, which then helps promotes the growth of the grasses and vegetation that those herbivores would feed on. So regardless of how you classify dingoes, they certainly are an important part of the landscape that's been there for at least 3,000 to 5,000 years, if not a lot longer than that. Now, moving from dingoes onto some other predators, we've got, of course, the Tasmanian devil right here. This is the largest marsupial type carnivore that Australia and Tasmania has. In fact, they were found in Australia up until about 600 years ago, and now they're only found on the island of Tasmania. And they're mid-range, they're small, so biggest marsupial carnivore is really a small benchmark to achieve, anywhere between 10 and 30 pounds. But they're a scavenger. They're going after dead wallabies and kangaroos, things like that. And to be able to do that, they crunch through bones quite effectively with a 200 pounds per square inch bite force, which is pound for pound one of the strongest bite forces in the world. And of course, they're known for being quite aggressive out on these landscapes where they interact with each other and meet when they're getting attracted to these carcasses. And their call is probably the reason why they got the name Tasmanian devil. You can imagine early settlers coming into Australia, hearing this out in the forest, you would assume there's a devil out there somewhere. So I'm going to play this call for you. So super crazy for sure. Now, a cousin of the Tasmanian devil are the quolls. And they kind of go with a black and white coloration on this eastern quoll, but they have a lot more spots than stripes than like the Tasmanian devil. One of my personal favorites of the quolls are spotted tail quoll. This is a cool one that can be seen on the itinerary. And they look a little bit like a cat. They're about the size of a domestic cat. In fact, early scientists researching Australian animals called them Australia's native cat. But they're not related to cats. They're actually related to the Tasmanian devil. They are a type of marsupial. And that beautiful spotted color that you see on the different species of quolls acts a bit like camouflage because they live in these forested environments, and by the light shining through those leaves, of course, if you've been in a forest that's been sunny before, you know you have that dappled light all along the ground. And that spotted coat helps them to blend in with that dappled coloration as they're moving around looking for prey. And they're just a really interesting animal, just one of those that not a lot of people heard about, but are certainly a beautiful creature and one to appreciate. Now, if we talked about devils, now we have to talk about dragons as well. In Australia, they have a lot of them. Any lizard in the family of agamids oftentimes is called a dragon. And there are a lot of them. There's upwards of 70 species of dragon lizards out on the Australian landscape. Probably the most famous is the bearded dragon. You can see right here. And they're actually quite popular in the pet trade. That's probably where they've gotten so famous, is they're a really easy lizard to take care of. Don't need a whole lot of effort, and they can actually be a little bit affectionate. That's like lizard level of affection, but they are quite a popular, probably the most popular lizard over iguanas in the pet trade. Now, the wild ones are known and named for that beard. You can see on this guy's chin right here, all those sharp scales that form that beard where they get their name. And they have a really interesting set of communication, means of communication with other rival males out on the landscape. They'll often start off by bobbing their head. You can see this dragon's actually turned his beard black. They can change color from light to dark, and then even flare that beard out, looking really menacing with their mouth open. You can even see their teeth and that menacing beard with all those spikes along it. And if you're the other dragon realizing that, you know what, I'm messing with something I don't want to, they say, sorry, mate, they wave, and that's their communication for submission, which is pretty funny to see. A couple other of my favorite lizards. We have the blue-tongued skink. This is a species that's found in kind of deserty areas, much like our bearded dragons typically are, and they're known for that tongue. And through research, scientists expect that that tongue is actually there to scare off predators. You're a bird, like an eagle or a kite or something, flying in, trying to catch this lizard. He'll open up his mouth really quickly, show off that bright blue tongue. Might be a little bit startling at first, and give that skink enough time to slither away. In addition to that, the tongue even actually has some UV reflectance, some ultraviolet reflectance. And birds like our eagles and kites can see that UV, so it even glows more for a bird than it does to our eyes. Another one of my favorites is the shingleback. This is a species where the head is on the upper right, and then the tail is in kind of the center right there on the bottom. And they look pretty similar, right? The head and the tail. And the shingleback actually stores a lot of fat in its tail, so it balloons up like that and looks a lot like the head. And so hopefully a predator will attack its tail first, and that hopefully will give it enough time to try to escape without having a talon or a mouth of the predator around its head. It can hopefully just pull its tail out and then continue on its way, which is a pretty cool adaptation. They look like a living pine cone as well, which makes them pretty interesting. Now, keeping with the reptile theme, let's talk about the world's biggest reptile. This is the saltwater crocodile found in Australia, and they can get huge. A full-grown, kind of max out size for salty is 20 feet long and upwards of 2,500 pounds. You can see in this picture right here, this is researchers and staff with the Australia Zoo. They're getting ready to capture a 15-foot croc. You can see how many people it takes to capture that size. And they're hoping to do some research and potential relocation of this particular individual. This happens from time to time in Australia. You have problem crocodiles and that get into areas where people frequent. And even though you put out signs and things like that, Australia, the people, even tourists, may get themselves into trouble with crocodiles. Now, when it comes to relocating crocodiles, it can be a little tricky depending on the area. One such crocodile up in Cape York in the northern part of Australia was relocated from one side of the Cape to the other. And remarkably, in just 19 days, it had traversed the 255 miles around the Cape to go back to its original home site, which is pretty incredible that they were home in to do that and to do it so quickly. And the reason, they're actually quite intelligent. The saltwater croc actually was using the tides in the currents along the Cape. And so every time the current was going in the right direction, that crocodile would get in there, slowly moving along or just floating along with the current, just using that like a conveyor belt. And then when the tide switched, he'd sink to the bottom or go out onto a beach like you're seeing here, and then wait for that current to just switch back in the direction he's going, get back in the water and ride it all the way around without using a whole lot of energy. And so when we look at a map of the range of our saltwater croc, you can see throughout parts of Southeast Asia and Australia, but then they have this massive nomadic range because understanding the currents through the ocean, these crocs can turn up in some places well away from where you typically expect to find them. In addition to being the largest reptile out there in the environment, they also have the strongest bite force of any animal. They have 3,700 pounds per square inch of bite force. For comparison, a lion has about 650 and a person has about 160, which means our crocodiles can go after just about anything they want to eat. They'll even eat sea turtles that have that strong shell to hopefully protect against a predator. And they've even been seen eating sharks. This is a salty that's going after a young bull shark that had swum up into one of the estuary systems, which is pretty incredible. Now, as far as water, kind of keeping along with that theme, we're going to take a very short dip into the Great Barrier Reef, because I could talk a lot about Great Barrier Reef animals, but just to kind of start off short, we're going to talk about some of the popular ones, a couple of my favorites. This is the clownfish, everyone are probably familiar with from various movies and television. The Ocellaris clownfish is the actual species name, and they live in the anemone. And ordinarily, that anemone would be quite stinging, but they have this mucus coating along their body that helps protect them. And they can live in this anemone in actually a bit of a symbiotic relationship. That anemone protects them from other predators, as well as they help the anemone keep it clean, as well as maybe attract some pests that the anemone will then eat. And this kind of setup right here with a few different clownfish in the same anemone is pretty typical. The female is the bigger one, kind of dead center in the screen. The male that she breeds with is in the upper left, and then there's a younger male off to the right, kind of hanging out in the periphery. That's pretty typical. The reason for this is because our clownfish do something pretty unique and pretty interesting. Say a predator were to come along and eat that female. Well, sad for a second, but our male clownfish that now has lost his mate will actually grow in size and internally switch his gender to female. And then one of those males along the outskirts comes in and takes his old place. So they actually change gender depending on whether those females are present or not, which is pretty cool. When you think about it, Finding Nemo would be an entirely different film if they were really true to life with what happens with Marlin there. Another one of my favorites saltwater critters is our banded sea crate. This is a really cool sea snake. They actually have snakes that slither through the ocean in places around Southeast Asia and Australia. Lovely black and white coloration. They can stay under for upwards of 15 to 30 minutes. And during that time, they're diving around through these corals and rock beds looking for any fish that are hiding around. So much in the same way an eel does that, so as our banded sea crate. they're able to do it so well. They don't have fins like a fish, but they have a flattened tail that acts like a paddle that helps move them along. All right, moving on to my last and arguably, I think personally, the best critters to talk about when it comes to talking about Australia are the monotremes, the echidna and the platypus. And the reason why I love talking about it as much as I do is they are so weird. So to start off with why they might be so weird is the fact that they split off from the mammalian grouping quite a while ago, about 166 million years ago. The monotremes did their thing, and the marsupials and the placental mammals like us and mice and dogs split off on their own. And because of that, they actually still lay eggs. So these are the only two types of mammals in the world that lay eggs. And you can see in this video from the Smithsonian Channel, you can see the egg inside of not a pouch like a marsupial, but actually two folds of skin that kind of grow up when that female's pregnant. She lays her eggs, puts those eggs along her stomach, and eventually a mammal hatches out, a young platypus in this case, which is really interesting, really weird to think about. Just a kind of small ping pong ball sized egg. Now you can see this is a female platypus with a couple of her young as they're growing up. Very similar to a marsupial, though they start off very, very underdeveloped. That's why you can see those bright pink little youngsters there. And for an echidna, one of my favorite facts about them is their youngster is called a puggle. They don't grow those quills. They don't have those quills in their egg. They actually have to grow those. That's why it looks really naked in this picture. This is from a rehabber. And unlike other mammals like our marsupials and us, they don't have teats or mammary glands for their young to drink their milk, but they still give off milk, and they have modified sweat glands along their stomach that just ooze milk out of their skin. So this is a rehabber feeding a puggle, but you can see much the same way that milk would be oozing out of that droplet, just like it oozes out of the skin, and then our youngster there is just lapping it up off the skin of its mother. And echidnas are super cool. They're essentially a cross between a hedgehog and an anteater. They have an excellent sense of smell. They have all those spines to protect themselves. They have super strong claws to dig into an anthill or a termite hill. And they have really long tongues, upwards of 7 inches, which is about half the length of the actual echidna. That tongue sticks out, and then a sticky saliva laps up all the insects in there. And these guys can go to town on a little termite mound, eating or moving their tongue in and out upwards of 100 times a minute, getting all the termites they possibly can. Now, when it comes to weirdest animal, though, I think platypus probably takes the cake. This is a species that looks like a conglomeration of a bunch of different animals. And in fact, it kind of is, with all the different unique adaptations it has. One of my favorites is that duck bill that it has. It isn't actually hard like a duck. It's got kind of a fleshy texture to it. And it's got all these receptors along the outside, like a shark, that can sense electricity. So if you look at this picture right here, you can actually see that you can't really make out the eyes. That's because its eyes are closed. When it's in the water, it's swimming with its eyes closed, just using the electrical sensor, a bit like a metal detector, and it's sweeping that bill back and forth through the rocks, looking for small crustaceans, crayfish, small bugs, things like that that it can lap up inside of its beak. Super interesting. But on top of that, once it has that crustacean, or in this case, a worm in its mouth, it can't chew it in the traditional way. It doesn't have any teeth. So it actually puts little bits of gravel in its mouth from the bottom of that river and uses that gravel, mushes it around with their food, and uses the rocks like teeth to be able to eat. And then on top of that, both the echidna and our platypus here, if you look at this the diagram of their digestive system, there's one big piece missing. There's no stomach. They don't have a stomach like we do. Their stomach, as a definition, is a chamber where all these digestive juices sit and then digest a lot of the proteins and sugars out of the food, and then that passes through and gets absorbed by the intestines. They don't have that. They have some unique enzymes and some acids moving through the whole system, but they don't have that stomach-like pouch that other animals do. On top of that, they have a bit of a prehensile tail, a bit like a monkey or an opossum. Grab leaves, like you can see right here. The possum's heading up screen, and it's got leaves in its tail so it can move around and then put into its burrow to make it nice and comfortable. here we're seeing the spine of a male opossum on its back foot, and a bit like a spur on a chicken, they use it to fight other males during the breeding season. But what's even more interesting than that is that spine is actually venomous. It's not deadly to people, but it's been said that it is a quite painful sting if you were to pick up a male possum during breeding season and actually get stung by the opossum. And this research just came out this year. Some scientists were looking at skins of different mammals and shining black lights at them. And what they found with the opossum is that it actually glows in the dark. When you shine a UV light at it, it emits that light back, what's called biofluorescence, which is something that previously really had only been seen in a few mammal species, and scorpions in particular are well known for that in the Southwest here. So, and to recap, why I think Australia, in particular, the platypus is the weirdest animal on the planet, is because it is part beaver with that lovely coat and those webbed feet, part duck with that bill, part shark with that electroreception that it has to sense animals moving around through the water. It has a prehensile tail, just like an opossum. Even has its nose and its eyes on the top of its head, so it barely sticks out of the water, just like an alligator or a crocodile. It's venomous like a rattlesnake, and even glows in the dark with a UV light, just like a scorpion. So you can imagine and understand why researchers, when they got a study skin of the platypus from Australia, it was sent to a museum in England. When they first looked at it, they thought it wasn't real, that they were like trying to pull it apart because there was stitching somewhere. Someone was messing with them. This wasn't a real animal. And it turns out it very much is. And every year we find out something more weird and more interesting about platypus. So personally, one of my favorite all-time animals in the world. So I hope probably kind of geeking out about some of the really interesting and unique wildlife in Australia. It's got you thinking like, I need to get to Australia and see some of these super cool critters. And if you're interested as much as I am, I highly recommend checking out our Australia trips. We have 2 different itineraries. The north itinerary here goes through the Great Barrier Reef, north of Brisbane, goes into the Daintree rainforest where those cassowaries are, checks out the beautiful water, aquatic, and coastal wildlife, and then goes into Kakadu, which is kind of a bit like an African savanna type environment where it has some cattle species and some interesting kangaroos and a whole wealth of birds in the wetlands as well. Or you can do the southern itinerary, which includes Tasmania, and get a chance to see the things like our echidna, a platypus, Tasmanian devil, and get a really cool experience along the south route along the Great Ocean Road of Australia. So I highly recommend, if you're as interested in weird and unique wildlife as I am, that you go ahead and check out Australia. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I'll open it up to see if there's any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. We've got some great questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Mike, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, a few people want to know if the Tawny Frogmouth is a type of owl.
Ooh, good question. It isn't. It's actually most closely related to what are called nightjars or nighthawks. You can find them here in the United States. That's our closest living relative, but they are a little bit of that convergent evolution, and then that they're meeting a lot of the same needs as owls do by hunting nocturnally. That being said, there are actual other owl species that you can find in Australia as well, but the Tawny Frogmouth has those big eyes, big mouth, and that really cryptic coloration, just like an owl does.
Mm-hmm. And there was also curiosity about the cassowary and the crest they have. What is that made of? What is its purpose?
Oh, yeah. So the crest of a cassowary, that really sets it apart from the emu. So that crest is keratin on the outside, same as our fingernails and our hair. Actually the same as its beak, or any bird beak is made out of keratin. But it's not solid keratin and it's not solid bone. It's actually a spongy material inside of there. And there's a few different ideas of why they have it. One is it might act a bit like a resonating chamber. We see this with hornbills in places like Borneo, where when they call, that sound resonates inside that chamber and makes that call a bit deeper and a bit stronger. So for an animal that lives in a rainforest where it's so thick you probably can't see 5 feet in front of you in places, being able to send that call way out allows them to be able to talk to each other quite well. Or it could be something as simple as the females like a man with a crest. That being said, both the males and females have the crest, or it could also even just help them by using that crest kind of moving forward. It's almost like putting your arm forward as you're walking through some vines or some trees that keeps that stuff from smacking you in the face if you've got something else to push through the forest instead.
Awesome. So we've got someone who's a big fan of reptiles and wants to know if the northern itinerary or southern itinerary would be better in terms of seeing snakes and lizards.
I would probably say the northern itinerary, just because it covers, I think, a little bit more diversity of habitats. And you're dealing with rainforest environment, like the Daintree rainforest. It's a prehistoric rainforest. It's potentially over 100 million years old. This forest has more or less been the same. And that's because Australia hasn't had a lot of plate tectonic changes over the years, so that's been changing where the forest has been. And so you get some really interesting and unique species. And of course, as I'm sure that person knows, rainforest environments really lend themselves to some pretty interesting diversity of reptiles. And also you head over to Kakadu, which is much more of a dry area near Darwin, and so you get some of those species as well. I would probably suggest that, but that being said, I think you're going to have a great time either way looking for reptiles on either itinerary.
Mm-hmm. And someone else wants to know specifically, which part of Australia would you see a bearded dragon?
Oh, so there's actually a number of different species of bearded dragons. There's like the inland bearded dragon. That's actually the specific species that this one is right here. That is the species that you see in the pet trade. There's the eastern bearded dragon. That more likely a chance to see that one. And those bearded dragons, their range is basically the entire swath of everything that isn't the outback. So the kind of red center of Australia. The eastern bearded dragon just goes from Cape York all the way down into southern Australia and parts of Tasmania. So there are different dragon species for basically all of Australia.
Great. And what size is a kangaroo when it leaves the pouch for good?
Oh, well, that depends a lot on the species. So they leave the pouch for good after about a year or so of growth, from pregnancy until the end. And let's see, for an eastern gray kangaroo, I would say, just to give you an idea of like kind of my length, so that would be probably about half their height. So we're talking maybe 3 feet tall, depending on the species of kangaroo, or maybe a little bit less than that. What's interesting is they're using individual variation in that some youngsters will stay with their mother a lot longer. They're a little bit harder to kick out of the nest, if you know what I mean. Whereas some just individual variation and personality will leave a lot sooner.
All right. A few people are wondering if Tasmanian devils are still experiencing that cancer that they were ravaged with a while ago.
Yeah, so it's something I didn't talk about, but Tasmanian devils, their biggest problem right now, aside from the typical stuff, which is like habitat loss and whatnot, they're dealing with a contagious facial tumor. And what that is they actually will get a cancer that's contagious. There's very few cancers that are outright contagious. This is one of them, and it's contagious among Tasmanian devils. And as you saw there with their pretty aggressive behavior, they can bite each other and scratch each other pretty frequently as part of just feeding. Even actually their breeding results in a lot of bites. That's kind of how they go about it. And so they easily transmit that contagious cancer, and those tumors grow along their face and can push out teeth or just make it super difficult for them to fit food in their mouth because those tumors are in the way. So oftentimes those animals starve to death because of those tumors. And that is still a thing that's happening in Australia. They've had some luck with some vaccines, but trying to vaccinate a population, I mean, we have a hard enough time vaccinating people in the United States or other parts of the world, let alone trying to vaccinate a wild population of animals out on a landscape. You can imagine the challenges that go into something like that. But in addition to that, what we're seeing in some places, those Tasmanian devils are developing immunity. And scientists are still researching exactly what is giving that immunity. Most likely it's something specifically genetic about those particular devils. And they're hoping with kind of, with selective breeding and things like that, they can release some of these immune Tassies into the environment and hopefully get those genes moving around and maybe beat these contagious tumors. So jury's still out exactly how that conservation is going to go, but I've got high hopes for it.
Okay. And which of the snakes that you covered today are venomous?
One of them. So the sea crate is venomous. The green tree python is non-venomous. And when we talk about venomous snakes in Australia, there are a number of venomous snakes in Australia, but they aren't necessarily that dangerous. When you hear about envenomations in Australia, oftentimes it's someone that's like messing with a snake or getting too close, those sorts of things. If you follow the same rules you follow just about any wildlife in the United States, which is give it its distance, don't harass it, watch it, see what it does, understanding its behavior, those sorts of things, you can be perfectly safe with venomous snakes in Australia as well. Acts the exact same way. The most venomous snake in the world is in Australia, called the inland taipan. That species is found in the center of the country, but very few envenomations actually happen, even though it's so deadly, just because it's not around people and people don't harass it, so it lives its life on its own. You live your life on your own, and you can be perfectly safe, even with that snake just a mile from your house.
Great. And the last question I'll take today, and I'm not sure how much information you have on this, but a lot of people are really curious about how Australia is doing after the wildfires. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So Australia gets wildfires every single year, just like a lot of different parts of the United States, like Alaska, where I guide. The same happens there as well. So a lot of species, especially plants, are especially adapted to a wildfire environment. That being said, in 2019 and early part of 2020, there was significant wildfires over across the landscape. And so those areas definitely had some severe damage, a lot of damage to property, some human life loss, as well as a lot of animals that lost their life during that process. And so the recovery is going to be slow and it's going to take years. That being said, because Australia is specially adapted for an environment like fire environment like that, there is a lot of rebound that is quite hopeful. And so through work with a lot of different conservation organizations, in fact, World Wildlife Fund Australia actually is doing a lot of work with the rebuild and releases, as well as like feeding wild populations to help alleviate and get them through some tough dry times. So those conservation organizations are doing a lot, and I'm super hopeful and interested in Australia, because I think they're going to bounce back just fine. It just may take a little bit of time, depending on where you're at in Australia.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. This has been fantastic. Australia is a beautiful location with such an amazing variety of unique wildlife. So it was really fun to learn about all this. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
All right. Thanks, Kendall. Well, again, thanks so much for joining me on my little journey through Australia's wildlife. It holds a special place in my heart because of such unique and interesting critters to talk about and learn about. And so if you've enjoyed it as much as I have, highly recommend checking out one of our Australia itineraries. Goes through some vast section of Australia, get a chance to see a lot of diversity of landscapes, cultural components, and a lot of wildlife as well. And so hopefully we'll tune in again for another wildlife talk sometime in the future. And until then, thanks so much and have a great weekend.
Thanks again, Mike. And just for everyone watching, you can definitely get in touch with an adventure specialist at our office if you have more information, wanting more information about our Australia trip. So give us a call at the number you see on the screen. So thank you so much for everyone for tuning in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation. We'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.